On January 28, 2001, as Americans gathered to watch the Super Bowl, one Syracuse family's day took a horrific turn. 18-year-old Jill Lynn Uto was supposed to join her mother and sister to watch the game that evening, but she never showed up. Concern quickly set in when Jill Lynn didn't answer her phone. The next day, her mother, Joanne Browning, visited her daughter's sixth-floor apartment at 600 James Street and walked into a nightmare. Inside, she found Jill Lynn lying unresponsive on a futon, brutally slain with multiple stab wounds and a deep cut across her neck. To this day, no one has been arrested for the crime. For family members and investigators alike, the question remains: who would viciously stab an 18-year-old in her own home on a Sunday afternoon, and why? Born on March 20th, 1982, Jill Lynn grew up with her mother and two sisters, Jenna and Carrie. Her family had moved from Colorado to upstate New York in the late 1990s in search of a different environment to raise the girls. In Syracuse, Jill Lynn came into her own as a friendly, outgoing teenager. By the start of 2001, Jill Lynn was striving for independence and building her future. At 18, she had recently moved out of her mother's house to live on her own for the first time. She rented a small studio apartment in a brick high-rise at 600 James Street in Syracuse's near northeast neighborhood. Jill Lynn was proud to be living on her own, even if it meant working hard to support herself. She juggled two retail jobs, including a position at a clothing store in the local shopping town mall. When Joanne Browning unlocked the door to Jill Lynn's apartment on January 29, 2001, she walked into a scene no mother should ever have to face. Jill Lynn had been stabbed inside her own home in a vicious attack. The perpetrator had used one of Jill Lynn's own kitchen knives as the weapon, turning an everyday household item into an instrument of horror. Investigators later noted that the attack was frenzied and deeply personal. Jill Lynn had suffered numerous stab wounds, and her throat had been slashed. This level of violence suggested a lot of rage on the part of the perpetrator, directed specifically towards Jill Lynn. Jill Lynn's body was found on her futon couch, indicating she may have been relaxing or sitting down when the assault began. One chilling detail of the crime was that there were no obvious signs of forced entry into the apartment. Police didn't find a kicked-in door or broken lock, which implies that Jill Lynn likely let the perpetrator inside willingly. Neighbors reported seeing Jill Lynn return to her apartment alone on the day of the slaying, with no stranger following behind. Sometime after she entered her apartment, she encountered the perpetrator. Whether this person knocked on her door or had arranged to visit, we may never know, but the lack of forced entry strongly suggests Jill Lynn knew and trusted the person. Investigators believe the attack happened on Sunday, January 28th, likely in the late afternoon or early evening. It appears the individual struck quickly and then slipped away quietly, as none of the neighbors in the busy building reported hearing a struggle loud enough to call police. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, the Syracuse Police Department launched an intensive investigation. Detectives swarmed the apartment on James Street, searching for any clues the perpetrator might have left behind. But from the start, tangible evidence was extremely scarce. The crime scene didn't yield obvious fingerprints, and the perpetrator had not brought a weapon, using a knife from Jill Lynn's kitchen instead. This weapon yielded no fingerprints, with the belief that the man was likely wearing gloves, a fact that wouldn't have stood out to anyone in January in upstate New York. Forensic teams collected potential DNA samples, fingerprints, and fibers from the apartment, hoping something would eventually lead to a suspect. Over the years, law enforcement interviewed multiple suspects and persons of interest, but none of those leads ever panned out into an arrest. One beacon of hope in the investigation emerged from DNA evidence. In 2016, 15 years after Jill Lynn's slaying, Syracuse police revealed that they had obtained a DNA profile that could help identify the perpetrator. This was a significant development, indicating that some biological material was recovered from the scene or the victim's body. With advancements in forensic technology, detectives hope to use this DNA to build a suspect profile or even find a match. However, as of today, that DNA has not conclusively identified the perpetrator, and it's unclear whether more modern techniques have been applied to the evidence. And yes, for everyone waiting for it, by more modern techniques, I do indeed mean genetic genealogy. What is known is that Syracuse does have a cold case squad and that they are actively investigating her case still. In the absence of an arrest, many theories have swirled around who might have slain Jill Lynn Udo and why. Investigators and those close to Jill Lynn have long debated whether the perpetrator was someone she knew or a stranger who targeted her at random. The evidence, or lack of it, can be interpreted to support either scenario, though most signs point towards someone familiar to the victim. Simply put, it's hard to imagine a young woman on her own willingly letting a total stranger into her apartment on a Sunday evening. Moreover, using a kitchen knife from the victim's own home as the weapon could imply that the attack wasn't pre-planned by an outside assailant. Instead, it might have been an impromptu crime of passion or anger. The sheer brutality, multiple stab wounds delivered in what appears to be a rage, hints at a personal motive. As forensic experts often note, stabbing is an intensely personal form of violence, often associated with strong emotions. Police scrutinized her circle of acquaintances in the months and years after the killing. Jill Lynn was known to have a wide social circle, and her uncle came out in an interview and publicly stated that not all of her friends were positive influences. It's conceivable she befriended someone with a volatile temper or dangerous tendencies. Detectives likely interviewed her recent ex-boyfriends, male friends, co-workers, and neighbors. However, none of those individuals have ever been publicly labeled as suspects. However, the idea of a co-worker when it comes to Jill Lynn is actually potentially a very wide net, since she worked in a mall. While perhaps her immediate co-workers were cleared, there's also the more generalized concept of co-workers within the mall. Perhaps someone at another store, or the food court, or in the administrative or security staff had become obsessed with her. While I can't prove it one way or the other, I suspect the authorities simply didn't have the resources to question literally every person connected to the mall. Notably, some have wondered if the attacker could have been a female friend rather than a male assailant, given the likely absence of an indecent assault. If she was subject to this sort of assault, the police would have had to release this information to the public due to concerns over safety. Female perpetrated stabbings are rarer, but not unheard of, especially if jealousy or personal betrayal was at play. Without any publicly known suspects, however, the gender and identity of the perpetrator remain pure conjecture. Given that investigators have advised that they do have a DNA profile, if this was from a woman, I suspect that this information would have been released to the public. After all, the default assumption is that a male committed the crime, so if it came out that it was a woman, this may generate significant new tips in the case. Another angle is the slim chance that a stranger did slay Jill Lynn. Skeptics of the known attacker theory point out that we can't be entirely sure she willingly let the person in. Perhaps her door was unlocked briefly, or the person knocked claiming some innocuous reason, like needing help or using the phone. Jill Lynn was known as kind-hearted and kind of naive, so she might have been vulnerable to a deceitful stranger. For now, those who love Jill Lynn refuse to let her case be forgotten. Each year around the anniversary of her death, local media run stories to generate new attention, and the police reaffirmed their commitment to solving the case. This collective perseverance means that the mystery of Jill Lynn's slaying is still very much in the public consciousness, raising the likelihood her case will be solved. The next time I talk about this case, I hope it's an update on how some genetic genealogy company and investigators cracked it once and for all. Cindy Weingar was a typical Vermont teenager in the late 1970s, until the night she vanished without a trace. In March 1979, the 16-year-old left her family's home on Forest Street to visit a friend and never returned. Just days later, her parents received a chilling anonymous phone call claiming that Cindy was dead and her body was at the bottom of the Winooski River. For over 4 decades, the fate of this Burlington high schooler has remained one of Vermont's most haunting, unsolved mysteries. Cindy Weingar grew up as the youngest of a big family. In fact, she was the youngest of 6 siblings, born 13 years after her nearest sister. By her junior year of high school, Cindy was a bright girl, but also a teenager testing boundaries. The family's strict rules couldn't stop her from befriending a rough crowd and occasionally blazing the broccoli. This phase worried her family, and in the weeks before she vanished, they even received eerie anonymous phone calls directed at Cindy. Despite these troubles, she was still a beloved kid at home, which made her abrupt disappearance all the more shocking. On the evening of March 21st, 1979, everything seemed normal at the family home on Forest Street. 16-year-old Cindy was last seen watching TV with her family before she said she was heading out to visit a friend nearby. She walked out wearing blue jeans, a green and white striped shirt, and low-top sneakers, and she never came back. When Cindy hadn't returned by the next morning, her mother knew something was wrong. The family contacted Burlington police, and the family started to frantically search the neighborhood and Cindy's usual hangouts. I'm going to shock you here. The authorities weren't very alarmed. Given Cindy's recent teenage rebellion, the police suspected she might have run away on her own and didn't immediately escalate the search. This response left the family feeling helpless and dismissed at the worst moment. Then came the phone call that turned their fear into a nightmare. A few days after Cindy went missing, her mother received an anonymous call from a man who delivered a disturbing message. Their daughter was tied up dead at the bottom of the Winooski River. The caller hung up without identifying himself. But there's a twist that made this even more disturbing than it usually would have been. The family changed their number recently in response to the threatening calls. Sources vary as to whether the new number was intentionally unlisted or whether it just hadn't hit the new phone books. But at any rate, the result is the same. That he somehow knew the family's new incognito number made the situation seem less like a cruel hoax and more like someone had obtained it from Cindy directly. They begged the police to take this tip seriously, but no organized search of the river was done at the time. Investigators couldn't verify the gruesome claim and still leaned toward the theory that Cindy had left by choice. For the Weingar family, however, that call felt like proof that something terrible had happened to their daughter. Reading between the lines here, it appears to me that the quote-unquote investigators may have believed that the call was hoaxed by the family to get the cops to take the case seriously. With few leads and a lackluster police response in 1979, Cindy's trail went cold fast, and years passed without any sign of her. In 1981, the family suffered another tragedy when Cindy's father, John, drowned in the river near their home. At John's funeral, a relative swore they saw a young woman standing in the back of the church who looked exactly like Cindy. Before anyone could approach, that woman slipped away, leaving the family wondering if Cindy had quietly returned to say goodbye to her dad. In the years that followed, A few other people claimed to spot someone resembling Cindy around Burlington, but none of these sightings could be confirmed. In 1985, a peculiar discovery briefly raised hopes. One of Cindy's sister's friends, while fishing in the Winooski River, snagged a clump of long blonde hair on her line. Recalling the anonymous caller's dire warning, she alerted the police. Unfortunately, without any other evidence or the ability to test DNA at that time, it was impossible to prove if the hair was Cindy's. Over the ensuing decades, Burlington police did periodically review Cindy's cold case, but no solid leads ever emerged. Officially, the case remained open, although her family strongly believed that labeling her a runaway early on had caused critical delays in the investigation. Cindy's parents passed away never knowing what happened, and her surviving siblings have refused to declare her dead, holding out hope that the truth will be discovered one day. When examining what might have happened to Cindy, two main theories stand out, each telling a very different story. Personally, I find myself torn between them, trying to weigh the evidence on each side. One possibility is that Cindy left on her own that night, essentially running away. This was the initial assumption by law enforcement. Indeed, Cindy was a teenager in a rebellious phase, chafing under strict rules and hanging out with a new crowd. Perhaps she wanted a taste of freedom, as so many people around that age do. Supporters of this theory note that there were reported sightings of her after she disappeared as evidence in favor of her survival. Maybe she felt she couldn't come back and chose to start over elsewhere in secret. However, it must be noted that all these so-called sightings remain completely unconfirmed and could honestly be wishful thinking on the part of her friends and family. Personally, I find the runaway theory hard to fully buy unless there was a much more sinister force pulling her away from home. Cindy left without taking any belongings or money, which is unusual for someone planning to be gone long. And would she really cut off all contact for decades? It's hard to imagine her watching her family suffer all this time without ever letting them know she was okay. Moreover, the sinister phone calls that targeted her, both before and after she vanished, don't fit with a simple runaway scenario. Those calls strongly imply that she was in some kind of danger, not just a teen quietly slipping away. So yeah, I have serious doubts that Cindy simply ran off to start a new life by choice. If this theory is accurate at all, I believe there's the possibility that she may have been trafficked, though there's no real evidence for it. She may have believed that she was running off to start a new life with an older quote-unquote boyfriend. This scenario is all too common, and she may have met someone participating in this disturbing trade when she started falling in with the wrong crowd. Traffickers directly prey on vulnerable young people and trick them into believing they're someone that can be trusted and has their best interest in mind instead of their family. But let's put this theory aside for a second. The other theory is that Cindy met with foul play, that she intended only a short outing, but fell victim to someone who meant her harm. The menacing calls to the family home before Cindy disappeared suggest that someone was threatening or stalking her. Then the anonymous caller who claimed she was dead in the river could well have been the perpetrator taunting her family with a confession. The fact that he knew an unlisted number hints that this person was likely someone acquainted with Cindy or her family. All of these points indicate that Cindy may have been targeted by someone she knew or encountered, rather than choosing to disappear. To me, the foul play theory is unfortunately the more convincing one. Perhaps Cindy went to meet a friend or acquaintance that night and something went terribly wrong. If she was harmed, the guilty party may have panicked and disposed of her body, and that disturbing phone call might have been a twisted attempt to confess. Given the evidence of direct threats and the complete silence from Cindy after that night, foul play by someone in her orbit seems the most plausible explanation. But back to the trafficking theory once more, since it potentially intersects with this theory. It's entirely possible that Cindy wasn't willing to do what a trafficker wanted her to do. Rather than let her go and leave evidence of the crime that was already committed, the perpetrator may have slain Cindy. Nearly half a century has passed since Cindy Weingar walked out of her Burlington home and vanished, yet her case remains as perplexing as ever. She's still listed as a missing person, and the investigation is still open to this day. That said, this is an investigation that was likely botched from the start by the common assumption that every teenager is simply a runaway. Her siblings haven't given up hope that they might one day learn what really happened on that March night in 1979. Hey everyone, Jimmy here with the usual reminder to click like and subscribe and to share this video with your friends and family. Also, don't forget to check out the YouTube membership or the Patreon. You can support my work for as little as $1 a month. Your support makes it possible for me to spend tons of time producing content, and perhaps most importantly, helps combat censorship in the topics I discuss. And don't forget to search up Lazy Chill True Crime wherever you get your podcasts, and follow me over there as well. On a cold winter day in February 1978, 19-year-old Mary Frances Gregory stepped into a car with a friend and set off from her hometown of Parry Sound in Ontario, Canada. She was headed for what she imagined would be a dream vacation in California, but she would never come home. Mary Frances Gregory's disappearance remains one of the most baffling cold cases to straddle the United States and Canada. More than 4 decades later, her fate is still unknown, leaving her family and investigators with more questions than answers. Mary was a 19-year-old resident of Parry Sound, a small, close-knit town on the shores of Georgian Bay in Ontario, Canada. Born on May 27, 1958, she was a young adult with her whole life ahead of her when she decided to embark on a trip to California. Like many teenagers of her era, she was excited for adventure, specifically a vacation to sunny California, a state which has an almost mythical level of magnetism for tourists. For reasons that aren't entirely known, her chosen destination was Palo Alto. Mary left Parry Sound on February 15, 1978, to begin her trip to California. She didn't travel alone. Accompanying her was a male acquaintance, described as a friend, who had agreed to drive her to the United States. The pair reportedly crossed the border via New York State on February 18, 1978. From there, according to the man's account, they embarked on a zigzagging road trip across the country. This indirect path, rather than a more direct route to California, has drawn scrutiny. At any rate, he later told authorities that he drove with Mary through New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and then finally reaching Nevada. This trip took place over 10 days and covered approximately 2,500 miles. Nearly 2 weeks after leaving Canada, the man claimed he dropped Mary off alone at a bus station in Las Vegas on February 28, 1978. This Las Vegas bus station drop-off is the last reported point where Mary was seen. However, it's important to note that this detail comes solely from the companion's account. Mary herself wasn't definitively cited by any independent witnesses in Las Vegas. No public explanation has ever been given for why Mary would have been left at a Las Vegas bus depot when her intended destination in California was still over 500 miles away. Mary never arrived in Palo Alto, or at least was never confirmed to be there, and was never heard from again. She had been carrying luggage on the trip, but her bags were never found after her disappearance. While some people find this part odd, personally, I find this to be the least unusual part of the case, since luggage gets lost all the time in travel and just ends up discarded. Her family received no calls or letters from her after she left home, and she simply vanished somewhere on the journey to her California dream. The disappearance of Mary Frances Gregory has been handled primarily by the Ontario Provincial Police in Canada. However, her case was also entered into California's missing persons records, given that Palo Alto was her intended destination. Notably, however, Mary is not listed as a missing person in Nevada, which raises questions about the legitimacy of the Las Vegas bus station account. Authorities have never publicly named the male travel companion who was with Mary, but police did speak with him, and he provided the cross-country travel story. His account remains the only version of events, and no independent witnesses have confirmed seeing Mary in Las Vegas or anywhere beyond her departure from Canada. Investigators have kept most details of the case confidential, and without concrete evidence of a crime, no arrests have been made. Without this concrete evidence, several theories have emerged about what might have happened to Mary, since the case is just so ripe for speculation. One possibility is that her companion's story was virtually entirely false. Skeptics wonder if Mary ever made it as far as Las Vegas, or if something befell her earlier in the trip. If the man harmed her somewhere along the way, he might have fabricated the bus station drop-off as a cover story. For instance, it's unclear why he would have left Mary in Nevada instead of driving her the rest of the way to California, a detail that many find deeply suspicious. The fact that Mary's bags disappeared with her, never turning up at any bus depot or with any lost luggage, reinforces the idea that she met with foul play. Many are skeptical that Mary even left Canada at all, and that perhaps the companion did something to her before even leaving the country. Notably, it's never been confirmed that the two ever crossed the border. In the 1970s, it was possible to cross the border just by swearing an oral declaration that you were indeed a Canadian citizen. Absolutely no identification was required whatsoever, and record keeping at the border for non-commercial travel was absolutely minimal. Some have suggested that the male companion may have taken Mary in an entirely different direction. While going south from Parry Sound leads to the metropolis of Toronto, going north from this town leads to vast wilderness. Further, Parry Sound itself has thousands of small, deep lakes, many of which are only accessible by foot or by plane. If the companion used a local lake as a dump site, it's entirely possible that this lake may be holding this dark secret until this day. As the last person to see her, the unnamed companion remains a focus of suspicion to this day in the minds of many, though authorities have never publicly labeled him a suspect. Another theory is that the friend was telling the truth about leaving Mary in Las Vegas, and that she fell victim to a stranger afterward. If Mary truly arrived alone in Las Vegas on February 28, 1978, she may have tried to continue on to California by herself. The late 1970s saw many young travelers come to harm while hitchhiking or trusting strangers. Mary could have been picked up by a predator that left her missing without a trace. Her family, for their part, believes that she may have had a dissociative fugue and simply went on to live a new life after this period of amnesia. I can see why this idea would be very attractive to her family members, as this is something that can legitimately happen. This theory would allow Mary to both be alive and living her best life, while having not ever intentionally abandoned her family. However, it's important to remember these states are extremely rare and usually only last a couple weeks at most. So while it may be comforting, it doesn't seem likely. Further yet, this scenario becomes even more unlikely when you take into account the surrounding circumstances with the male companion she was with. While both Ontario and California have open investigations into this case, given the jurisdictional issues, it's unclear how significant any ongoing efforts are. Unfortunately, it seems that Mary's case largely fell through the jurisdictional cracks and into obscurity. It was a routine Saturday afternoon in Crest Hill, Illinois, when 50-year-old Wendy Gessing walked out of her job and seemingly vanished into thin air. On June 12th, 2021, Wendy was partway through her shift at Pizzas by Marcelloni, which was a local pizza shop owned by her longtime boyfriend. She stepped away to run a quick errand and ended up dropping off the face of the earth, leaving people still wondering where she is over 4 years later. However, in 2025, it would turn out that a dark secret from Wendy's past might provide the most plausible explanation for what happened in this disturbing, unsolved mystery. On the afternoon of June 12, 2021, around 4 p.m., Wendy received a phone call while at work. She told a coworker she was stepping out briefly to give someone a ride, and then drove off in her gray Honda CR-V, possibly heading toward nearby Joliet. That was the last time anyone saw Wendy, and she never returned to the pizzeria and didn't make it home. When Wendy failed to come back, her family reported her missing, and police began to search. In the next few days, 2 puzzling clues turned up. On June 15th, her cell phone was found discarded along a road in Romeoville, a town several miles away. 2 days later, on June 17th, Wendy's Honda was discovered abandoned on a dead-end street in Joliet. The car was parked on Bell Avenue, a street known for frequent police calls and criminal activity. Law enforcement mobilized significant resources and expertise to find Wendy. Crest Hill Police led the case, assisted by the Will County Sheriff's Office and the FBI. Detectives executed numerous searches and warrants, analyzing cell phone records, surveillance videos, and any physical evidence from her car. By 2025, over 25 search warrants had been issued, and at least 8 locations, from homes to wooded areas, had been scoured for any trace of Wendy. Nearly 200 pieces of potential evidence were collected, and Wendy's vehicle itself was combed for clues, yet nothing has definitively revealed what happened to her. Early on, a tip suggested Wendy might have been spotted at a Motel 6 in Joliet a few days after she vanished. Reports claim that extremely grainy security footage did show a woman who could technically be her at that motel, but the image was too poor to be conclusive. Notably here I say reports claimed, since I haven't been able to find this footage myself online, and I'm usually pretty good at sniffing that sort of thing out on local news sites. Notably, Wendy's boyfriend doubted that the woman on the tape was her, and police could not confirm the sighting. Aside from that unverified lead, no confirmed trace of Wendy ever surfaced after she left the pizza shop. Throughout the investigation, Wendy's digital footprint remained eerily silent. No bank withdrawals or social media activity occurred after she went missing. Her boyfriend had an extremely solid alibi at a nearby social club during the time of her disappearance. In fact, authorities explicitly ruled him out, and he has been fully cooperative with the investigation throughout the entire time. And while sometimes I would question these findings when it's just a local police department involved, this is a case where the FBI is on it as well. With her inner circle largely ruled out, detectives focused on leads beyond her immediate family. Nearly 4 years later, in 2025, police announced a breakthrough. Crest Hill's police chief revealed they had identified a person of interest in Wendy's case. This individual had been in contact with Wendy in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, and was allegedly involved in the local street pharmaceuticals scene. Investigators noted that the person of interest was known to frequent the same Joliet neighborhood where Wendy's car had been dumped. Furthermore, Wendy's phone had last pinged in an area that this person was known to often visit. These overlaps, personal contact with Wendy, and ties to the locations where her belongings turned up, made the unnamed individual a major focus of the investigation. Police have kept tabs on this person and have been in communication with them, though no arrest has been made as of yet. While authorities stopped short of officially calling this person a suspect, the development has given the case a new direction and renewed hope of finally finding answers. Given the evidence, a voluntary runaway scenario appears very unlikely. Wendy did nothing to prepare for disappearing and left behind everything important to her. Her finances were untouched, and she contacted no one after June 12th. Those who knew her insist she would never have simply walked away from her life, and all signs suggest Wendy did not vanish by choice. Most theories therefore involve foul play. The most plausible scenario is that Wendy met with someone that afternoon who intended to harm her. As I mentioned at the beginning of this segment, she left work to help someone by giving them a ride, implying she met a specific individual. If that meeting turned dangerous, it could explain why her car was later left in a particular spot and her phone discarded elsewhere. This was likely an attempt by a perpetrator to cover their tracks. The person of interest identified by police fits this narrative, someone who knew Wendy and had potential criminal motives. It's possible Wendy was unwittingly pulled into a situation involving illegal activity and became a target of violence. However, there's that one dark secret I hinted at in the beginning of this segment. Wendy had a history of substance use problems, though she had been clean for some time. The early stages of a relapse are generally considered the most risky in terms of an overdose, since the tolerance for the substance has faded. An individual may believe they can take the sort of dose they took while they were in their addiction and had built up a tolerance, and then unfortunately, accidentally OD. It's possible that she ended up overdosing in a trap house, and that the dealer took steps to cover up what happened. Personally, this is the theory I prefer, since it appears to fit all the evidence in the case, now that the authorities have identified the person of interest in the case. Today, Wendy Gessing's fate remains unresolved, though it appears that the police are closer than ever to closing this case out once and for all. For 4 years, no one even realized that Heather Bloom was missing. From late 2005 until 2009, her disappearance went entirely unreported, a delay that hindered efforts to find her. Heather was a 28-year-old woman with Down syndrome who depended on others for every aspect of her care. Yet she managed to vanish without a trace from Berkeley, California in 2005 on a trip from New York where her mother dumped her off with her sister. Even more chilling, the only person who might know what happened refused to let anyone see Heather and then quietly left the country in the years that followed. It seemed unthinkable that a vulnerable woman like Heather could vanish without anyone noticing, but it happened. Nearly 2 decades later, the question remains, what really happened to Heather Bloom? Heather had spent her entire life in New York, so a trip to California was a major change for her. Heather's story took a mysterious turn in the fall of 2005 when she and her mother stayed with Heather's sister Sherry. This visit would be the last time Heather was seen by anyone outside her family. During the stay, police were called to Sherry's apartment to intervene in a loud argument between Phyllis, the mother, and Sherry, with Heather in the middle of the commotion. The officers diffused the situation, and once things calmed down, Phyllis returned home to New York, leaving Heather in Sherry's care at the Berkeley apartment. That unusual handoff of Heather to Sherry marked the beginning of Heather's unexplained absence. For a while, nothing apparently seemed amiss, and after Phyllis left California, she apparently lost contact with both of her daughters. She heard no updates from Sherry and had no direct communication with Heather. Heather, a vulnerable adult who couldn't speak for herself, simply vanished from public view. There were no familiar neighbors or friends in California to notice her absence, and Heather wasn't enrolled in any local care programs or services that might have raised an alarm. It wasn't until June 2009, nearly 4 years later, that Phyllis finally reported Heather missing. When Berkeley police opened a missing person investigation in 2009, they were already years behind. Detectives discovered that Sherry had moved out of her apartment back in 2007, leaving no sign of where Heather had gone. It took months to track Sherry down, and when they finally located her in March 2010, the mystery only deepened. Sherry refused to let officers inside her home, speaking to them only through a window. She insisted that Heather was fine, but would not allow anyone to see her, offering no evidence of her sister's well-being. This evasive behavior raised immediate red flags for the police, who feared for Heather's safety. However, it also put law enforcement in a bind. They were alarmed, but without clear evidence of wrongdoing or a court order, there was little they could do to force Sherry's compliance. Police soon uncovered more unsettling details. Sherry's landlord and neighbors reported that they had never seen Heather at the apartment, not even once. Shortly after that tense welfare check, Sherry abruptly packed up and moved again, disappearing before authorities could learn anything more about Heather's fate. She was evicted from the apartment for owing around $13,000 in back rent, suggesting a chaotic and unstable situation. Once Sherry left town this time, the trail to find Heather went cold again. Years passed with no sign of either sister. Finally, in 2016, a breakthrough. Investigators learned that Sherry had left the country and gone to Norway on a student visa. She had moved overseas for school, which explained why she had been so hard to find. Sherry's relocation abroad posed a major roadblock for the investigation. Berkeley police and local journalists tried to contact Sherry in Norway, but she never responded. Given Heather's disabilities, it seemed unlikely she could have traveled overseas under the radar. Most likely, if she was still alive, she remained somewhere in California. But with Sherry out of reach and refusing to cooperate, authorities had no leads on where to look next, and no way to verify Heather's condition or whereabouts. Several theories have emerged to explain Heather Bloom's disappearance. The most direct suspicion falls on Sherry. As the last person with Heather, Sherry's odd behavior has led many to believe she knows exactly what happened. Her refusal to produce Heather on demand and her pattern of abruptly moving away suggest she may have been hiding something all along. Neighbors didn't report seeing Heather around at any time. This fuels a grim theory that Heather may have perished under Sherry's care, whether due to untreated health issues, an accident, or even something more sinister. For the first two options, there's always the potential that Sherry panicked and covered it up instead of reporting it. However, authorities have found no evidence of foul play and have not charged Sherry with any crime. Officially, Heather remains a missing person, not a confirmed crime victim. Another possibility is that Heather is alive but was secretly placed in a care facility or with a caretaker, and even the police have entertained this hopeful scenario. Perhaps Sherry became overwhelmed by the responsibility and, without telling anyone, arranged for Heather to live in a private care home or with another caregiver. It's even possible that she took her out of state to dump her off somewhere else, perhaps simply leaving her abandoned in a hospital waiting room. If so, Sherry's secretiveness could have been her way of avoiding legal trouble for abandoning her dependent sister. This theory lines up with the optimism police expressed, the hope that somewhere, Heather has been receiving the care she needs, even if her identity isn't known to authorities. However, so far, checks of hospitals and care homes haven't turned up any trace of Heather under another identity, but the possibility cannot be ruled out. Perhaps the most sinister allegation is that Heather's mother and sister colluded to make her quote-unquote disappear. Some have speculated that Phyllis might have willingly left Heather with Sherry as part of a plan. Moving Heather across the country would make her absence in New York much less noticeable, and would provide an easy explanation for why Heather was no longer there. However, this allegation falls apart extremely quickly under scrutiny. It was Phyllis who eventually sounded the alarm in 2009, an unlikely move if she had intended for Heather's disappearance to go unnoticed as it had been. Authorities have never implicated Phyllis in any wrongdoing, and officially she was a distraught parent seeking help to find her missing child. Though of course it's inescapable that even in the official version of events told by Phyllis, it appears she dumped off her disabled daughter with her non-disabled daughter. After that, Phyllis washed her hands clean of both of them for 4 years, which brings me to my next point. One lingering question is why Phyllis waited so long to report Heather missing, and what triggered her to eventually do so. It's an aspect of the case that continues to baffle observers. We may never know what was going through the mother's mind during those 4 years. What is certain is that the delay in reporting has made investigating Heather's disappearance that much more difficult. This lost time is one of the most frustrating facets of the case, leaving basically everyone to wonder if the outcome might have been different had the alarm been raised sooner. Another question that's been raised is who was cashing Heather's government checks intended for her care during those 4 years, if anyone. I suspect the authorities already know the answer to this question, and simply haven't released this to the public. However, I do question whether a forensic accountant has looked over the accounts of both Sherry and Phyllis, though I suspect that isn't possible since neither have been implicated officially. Today, nearly 20 years after she vanished, there is still no answer to Heather Bloom's fate. Heather would be in her late 40s now, but no one knows whether she is alive or not. However, I'm hopeful that the simplest solution is the accurate one in this case. Heather may have been abandoned as an unknown person somewhere safe, and she's now being cared for by the state. It's not ideal by any means, and it's both incredibly sad and infuriating, but the alternatives are so much more disturbing. Of course, the conduct of the sister and the mother is already disturbing regardless. Heather needed love and care, and it appears that at best, she got abandonment twice, by 2 of the people who were supposed to love and care for her most. So yeah, this is one of those stories that really makes me question humanity, which is saying a lot considering that I constantly research and cover dark content. A wrecked blue Jeep Renegade lies on its side in a sun-scorched ravine near Buckeye, Arizona, its airbags deployed and windshield shattered. On the ground are the clothes and personal items of its driver, 24-year-old geologist Daniel Robinson. In June 2021, Daniel drove into the desert and vanished without a trace, leaving behind only this chilling scene. Daniel Robinson was a 24-year-old field geologist who moved from South Carolina to Arizona after college to start his career. Born without his right hand, he never let that hold him back. He earned a degree in geology and landed a job in the Phoenix area. By June 2021, Daniel was working on remote hydrogeology projects in Arizona's deserts. He was known as a dedicated, friendly young man who stayed close with his family, and none of them imagined that his next routine workday would mark the start of a baffling mystery. On the morning of June 23, 2021, Daniel drove to a remote desert well site in Buckeye for a routine work assignment. He met a coworker there for the first time, but Daniel was acting strangely, staring off into the distance and making odd comments. He even asked the coworker if they wanted to wrap up early and go back to Phoenix, then abruptly got in his Jeep and drove off around 9:15. He was noted to be heading west deeper into the desert instead of back toward town, and he was never seen again after that. When Daniel didn't come home or answer his phone later that day, his family knew something was wrong. His father filed a missing person report by that evening, and police began searching around the job site. Officers and helicopters scoured the area for any sign of Daniel or his vehicle. Attempts to ping his cell phone for location also came up empty, but there were no tracks, no clues, and no answers. Daniel had vanished into the desert, seemingly without a trace. Nearly a month later, on July 19th, a rancher stumbled upon Daniel's Jeep in a ravine, roughly 3 miles from the work site. The SUV was on its side, evidently crashed from a rollover, with airbags deployed, but no sign of Daniel himself. His cell phone, wallet, keys, and even his clothes were found on or around the vehicle, as if he had left them behind. This discovery deepened the mystery, and police downloaded the Jeep's internal data and found that it had been driven about 11 miles after the airbags deployed. Notably, the ignition had been turned on over 40 times after the crash. These readings led Daniel's family and their private investigator to suspect the crash might have been staged. However, Buckeye Police consulted Jeep experts who said an 11-mile odometer discrepancy isn't unusual. Notably, the ignition cycles could be attempts to restart the disabled car or electronic glitches during the recovery. In their view, the evidence still pointed to an accident. The Jeep likely rolled into the ravine when Daniel tried to drive out of a tough spot. But if it was an accident, the obvious question of where Daniel was still remained completely unanswered. With the Jeep found, search teams focused intensely on the surrounding desert. It's an unforgiving landscape of blistering heat, and any tracks or clues could vanish quickly, erased by wind and even small passages of time, let alone a month. Police and volunteers, many organized by Daniel's determined father, scoured the ravines, used dogs and drones, and even lowered cameras into mine shafts. Despite covering a huge area, they found no trace of Daniel. The search had a few false alarms. In late July, a human skull was discovered, but testing confirmed it wasn't Daniel's. Other sets of bones were discovered that later proved to be from animals. Investigators did turn up a few perplexing clues that suggested something more unusual. They noted red paint from another vehicle on Daniel's Jeep, hinting at a possible collision before the crash. They also found out that in the days before he vanished, Daniel had exchanged texts with a woman he delivered groceries to, and he showed up at her house unannounced. This apparently got so bad that she had to tell him to stop. In another odd twist, someone mysteriously accessed Daniel's computer after he went missing, as if entering his Tempe apartment while he was gone. These clues gave investigators plenty to ponder, but no definitive answers. The case was growing colder, and everything about it seemed off-kilter, leaving his family and police, as well as the public at large, grasping at theories to try to explain the case. One theory is that Daniel crashed and then wandered off into the desert, eventually succumbing to the elements. He may have been injured or disoriented from the rollover, which could explain why he shed his clothes. This is a behavior sometimes seen in severe heat stroke and the confusion that comes along with it. In this scenario, Daniel would have walked until he collapsed. In the searing Arizona sun, it would not take long for dehydration or heat to become deadly. The desert's vastness, plus scavenging animals, might then explain why no remains have been found. Supporters of this theory note the lack of any signs of struggle at the Jeep, and that investigators uncovered no evidence of foul play in his personal life. Daniel's family and private investigators suspect someone else was involved in his disappearance. They point to the unexplained red paint transfer on his Jeep, possibly from another vehicle, and the data showing extra miles driven after the crash. The private investigator has even suggested the accident scene was potentially staged to cover up a crime. In this view, someone might have dumped the Jeep in the ravine to fake an accident. Indeed, a rancher insists the vehicle wasn't in that spot during the first weeks of searching. The fact that someone went into Daniel's apartment and used his computer after he went missing also hints at a possible cover-up. So far, police say they have no proof of any crime and haven't named suspects, but the Robinson family believes that critical clues pointing to foul play could still surface. Of course, some people are naturally skeptical about the role of a private investigator in a case such as this, where there's no definitive evidence of foul play. Another theory is that Daniel left on his own, either due to a mental breakdown or a wish to start a new life. His odd behavior that morning, asking to leave work early and staring into space, might indicate he was upset or not thinking clearly. It's possible he became disoriented or even decided to walk away from everything. However, this theory lacks evidence, and Daniel made no preparations to disappear. Police questioned friends and family to see if Daniel was having difficulty over any issues, and everyone said he wasn't. However, those who support this idea believe this may have something to do with the incident with the woman he had spent time texting with. There are more far-flung theories as well, and some armchair detectives have wondered if Daniel might have stumbled upon something illegal in the desert. Notably, it's theoretically possible that he could have come across a trafficking operation of some kind and been eliminated. Under this theory, he could have tried to flee in his Jeep and been pushed off the road and then slain. That said, the only evidence to support this is entirely circumstantial, making this likely more fiction than fact. Today, Daniel Robinson's fate remains unknown. Buckeye police insist they're still actively investigating and will keep the case open until Daniel's found. However, they've made it amply clear that they consider Daniel's case a missing person situation, not a slaying. On a January morning in 1984, two unknown men walked into Jack Brown's real estate office in Ypsilanti, a suburb of Detroit, and carried out a brazen execution in broad daylight. They ignored the receptionist and went straight for 47-year-old Jack Brown. One intruder shot Jack at point-blank range while the other stood guard, leaving his three co-workers unharmed. The perpetrators took nothing, confirming it definitely wasn't a robbery. To this day, the identity of the attackers and their motive remain a chilling mystery. Jack Brown was a 47-year-old real estate broker and lifelong Ypsilanti resident. He owned a small realty and insurance firm and was active in the local Chamber of Commerce and Rotary Club. Jack was a married father of two and had no known ties to crime or any enemies. He was well known around town, and none of his friends or colleagues could imagine why anyone would want to harm him. This made his violent slaying all the more bewildering. On Wednesday, January 11th, 1984, around 11:10 that morning, two men entered Jack's office suite in Ypsilanti. Without a word, one headed straight into Jack's private office, while the other herded the three employees into a bathroom. Jack was on a phone call at that moment, reportedly talking to his son in the hospital, and he managed to say something along the line of, "There's trouble here," before the line went dead. The attackers immediately fled after locking the staff in the restroom, harming no one else. Jack's colleagues called 911, but by the time help arrived, he was unconscious. He died early the next morning at the hospital despite emergency surgery. At first, police wondered if a traditional robbery was the motive, but a safe in Jack's office was found open, with no money missing, so that theory was quickly dismissed. The police couldn't determine if the attackers opened the safe or if it was incidentally open at the time of the attack. But keep this in mind because I'm going to come back to this in a second, since that safe may have stored something more valuable than cash. Witnesses gave descriptions of the assailants, and police sketches showed one about 6 feet tall in a beige jacket, and the other around 5 feet 10 inches in blue coveralls and a knit cap. The men appeared to know the office layout, suggesting the attack was planned in advance. Despite these clues, the perpetrators have never been identified. Detectives dug through Jack's background for a motive but found none. He had no criminal record, no significant or unusual debts, and no history of shady dealings. Brown wasn't known to engage in any criminal lifestyle, leaving investigators baffled as to why he would be targeted. They even considered whether he led a secret double life, but uncovered no evidence of any hidden activities. Still, a few intriguing hints emerged. Jack's brother Norm said that on the night before the attack, he saw Jack having an intense, angry phone conversation at the office. When it ended, Jack claimed it was nothing serious and wouldn't elaborate. Norm later suspected that call was connected to the crime, though he had no solid proof of this other than the timing. Jack's wife Anne also recalled an eerie incident. A few weeks before the slaying, Jack had mentioned making a list of, quote, powerful people involved in illegal acts and hiding it in a safe deposit box. Anne brushed it off at the time, and Jack never brought it up again. And yeah, I think we all know that powerful people don't have a problem with a little bit of violence to conceal the lists that they may or may not be on. After his death, she searched for any such list or key but found nothing. This bizarre memory made investigators wonder if Jack knew dangerous secrets about influential individuals that gave someone a motive to silence him. Another notable coincidence was that on the day Jack was slain, the local police carried out a major raid on some higher-level street pharmacists, spurred by an anonymous tip. This led to speculation that Jack could have been that tipster, or otherwise had knowledge of the operation, and that his slaying was an act of retaliation. No proof linked Jack to the case, but the timing was hard to ignore. The leading theory is that Jack was slain on orders of powerful criminals he had crossed. Perhaps he had information about local traffickers or corrupt officials on a list stored in his safe. The cold, calculating manner in which the attack was carried out suggests the motive wasn't personal. However, the duo allowed their faces to be seen by a number of witnesses, suggesting that these guys might not have been in the big leagues, so to speak. Another theory is that Jack was secretly involved in something illicit, and it backfired on him. If he had a hidden criminal venture or unsavory associates, one of them might have decided to eliminate him when a deal went bad. However, investigators found no evidence of any secret life or illegal activity by Jack. One more speculative theory that is truly both disturbing and chilling turns on Jack Brown's very common name. This theory suggests that Jack could have been slain precisely due to his common name. It suggests that another Jack Brown perhaps owed a very large amount of money to an organized crime syndicate. Rather than eliminating the second Jack Brown and therefore not being repaid, they may have told him to get a newspaper from Michigan on January 12, 1984, no reason given. Under this theory, the second Jack Brown would have seen that a man with the exact same name was slain on the day after they told him to get a paper from Michigan. This would have perhaps sparked extreme fear in the target, forcing him to liquidate all his assets and pay back the organization very rapidly. It's entirely speculative and sounds like something more out of a movie, but it is a possibility. More than 40 years on, the question of why this attack happened to Jack Brown remains a haunting, unsolved mystery. It's a stark reminder that even an ordinary man with no known enemies can become the target of an extraordinary crime for apparently no reason. Until new evidence comes to light or someone talks, Jack's case will remain cold, but definitely not forgotten. A worried father arrived at his daughter's apartment in Minot, North Dakota one June afternoon in 2007, concerned after days of unanswered calls. Finding 18-year-old Anita Knutsen's car outside but no response at the door, he enlisted the building manager's help to get inside. Through Anita's bedroom window, her father saw a horrifying scene. Anita lay lifeless on her bed. He immediately called 911, summoning police to the gruesome scene. In that moment, a family's world shattered, and in time, a horrific and shocking secret would crack this case wide open, or at least, that's what investigators wanted to believe. Anita was a bright and hardworking college freshman at Minot State University, pursuing a degree in elementary education. Anita had been adopted as an infant by Gordon and Sharon Knutsen and grew up in a loving family. She graduated from Velva High School in 2006 and was known for her kindness and strong work ethic, juggling her studies with part-time jobs at a clothing store and a hotel. Friends and family described Anita as joyful, caring, and always ready to help others. On June 4, 2007, after Anita failed to answer her phone for 2 days and even missed a work shift, which was unlike her, her father drove to her off-campus apartment to check on her. He found the front door locked and no sign of movement inside. A maintenance worker then pointed out that the screen from Anita's bedroom window was lying on the ground with a slit cut through it. Looking through the window, Anita's father saw a nightmare. His daughter was lying face down on her bed in a pool of blood. Police rushed to the scene and soon confirmed that Anita had been stabbed to death, later determined to be 2 fatal knife wounds to her chest. A robe had been draped over her body, and while the bedroom was bloody, nothing seemed to be stolen or ransacked in the apartment. Investigators suspected the sliced window screen was a ploy to mislead them, since the apartment door was still locked and the evidence didn't line up with a typical break-in. The brutal slaying of a well-liked young woman in a small city like Minot left family and friends in utter shock. Investigators later estimated that Anita had been killed over the weekend, likely late on June 2nd or early June 3rd, 2007. Despite a thorough investigation, police initially had few leads to go on. They interviewed Anita's friends, co-workers, and neighbors, trying to piece together her final days. Naturally, attention turned to Anita's roommate at the time, Nicole Thomas, now known as Nicole Rice, but Nicole told investigators she had been out of town visiting family. According to investigators, her alibi had some inconsistencies, yet in 2007, there wasn't enough evidence to tie her or anyone else to the crime. Further yet, she was a quiet female roommate, not the usual sort of person who commits this sort of act against a young woman who is ostensibly home alone. Detectives also explored other possibilities. For example, a maintenance man who worked at the apartment complex, and even a report of an unknown man seen running near the building, but none of these leads panned out. Forensic evidence didn't clinch the case either. The knife found at the scene contained DNA from multiple people, which meant no definitive match to a suspect could be made. With no arrests and no prime suspect, the investigation stalled. As months turned into years, Anita's case went cold. The notion that a predator was still roaming free haunted the community, leaving residents fearful while the family's pleas for justice continued unabated. Still, Anita's loved ones refused to let her memory fade. They pressed authorities for answers and kept the case in the public eye, hoping that someday there would be a breakthrough. Pink ribbons were tied around trees in Minot, and a billboard with Anita's photo went up, somber reminders of the young woman whose killer remained at large. In 2022, nearly 15 years after Anita's death, an unexpected break finally came. On March 16, 2022, Minot police stunned the community by announcing the arrest of 34-year-old Nicole Rice, Anita's former roommate, for the brutal attack. She was taken into custody at her job on the Minot Air Force Base. At a press conference that day, Minot's police chief confidently announced that they finally had the person responsible for Anita's slaying in custody. Authorities credited a collaboration with the Oxygen Network's Cold Justice true crime TV series for helping crack the long cold case. In 2019, the Minot police had assigned new detectives to re-examine the evidence, and with fresh eyes they enlisted Cold Justice to spread word of the case. New investigators had re-examined every detail of the case, and with this renewed effort, they found reasons to focus on Nicole. They noted alleged significant inconsistencies in Nicole's alibi and uncovered witnesses who reported that Nicole had made suspicious comments about the event in the past. After the Cold Justice episodes about Anita's case aired in late 2022, new tips, including those alleged confessions, flowed in to investigators, bolstering the case against Nicole. These developments gave police probable cause to charge Nicole at last. In the face of the accusations, Nicole maintained her innocence and pleaded not guilty to the charges. In March 2025, Nicole Rice finally went on trial for the slaying of Anita Knutson, a case that had haunted the community for nearly 18 years at that point. The trial took place in Grand Forks to help try to ensure an impartial jury. Over 7 days in court, more than 20 witnesses testified as prosecutors and defense attorneys presented very different narratives of what happened. Prosecutors laid out a theory that the crime stemmed from a toxic roommate relationship that spiraled out of control. They argued that Nicole and Anita had a history of petty conflicts, including disagreements over things like alarm clocks, internet usage, and household chores. They claimed that on the night of the slaying, a heated argument between them turned violent. According to the prosecution, Nicole stabbed Anita in a fit of rage, and then tried to cover her tracks by staging the scene to look like an intruder was responsible. Investigators pointed out how nothing was actually stolen from the apartment, and forensic tests showed the blood on the fallen window screen came from Anita herself. This was a sign that the screen was cut after she was attacked, rather than by an outside intruder, supporting the theory that the break-in was staged. One officer testified that when Nicole was first contacted about Anita's death, she oddly mentioned that her iPod was missing. He found this extremely odd that she was so concerned about a missing iPod when someone had allegedly just broken into her home and slain her roommate. This cop later reflected that it seemed like an attempt to support the burglary story and deflect suspicion. And this is really a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. If you don't report what happened, you're withholding potentially material evidence, and if you do report it, that's apparently suspicious. The prosecution's most startling evidence came from two people who said that Nicole had effectively confessed years earlier. A former friend of Nicole's testified that at a party in 2008, Nicole got drunk and tearfully blurted out that she had argued with Anita and that she then, quote, did it. Similarly, an ex-boyfriend of Nicole's recounted another occasion where a heavily intoxicated Nicole allegedly said she had eliminated Anna. Both witnesses claimed they thought they had told police about these admissions back in 2008, though no official record of those reports was found. These alleged drunken confessions, combined with the circumstantial evidence of motive and a staged crime scene, formed the crux of the case against Nicole Rice. And that's the broad overview of the evidence as it was presented to the jury. By way of reminder, the prosecution has to prove the accused to be guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense, however, contended that the state's case was built on speculation and unreliable memories. Nicole's attorney pointed out that there was no physical evidence linking her to the attack. Investigators had not produced any DNA, fingerprints, or forensic proof placing Nicole in Anita's bedroom at the time of the crime. The entire accusation, the defense argued, rested on circumstantial details and hearsay. They cast doubt on the confession stories, noting that they emerged only after a TV show reignited interest in the case. Notably, they said that it was suspicious that both witnesses quote-unquote remembered these confessions so many years later. Defense lawyers suggested that the Cold Justice television show had inadvertently created a frenzy around the case. They suggested that this caused the confessions to be remembered, perhaps falsely, possibly causing them to zero in on Nicole without considering other suspects. They reminded jurors that early in the investigation, others had been persons of interest. Yet those leads were never fully resolved or even completely investigated. In fact, the defense called a retired FBI agent as an expert witness to walk the jury through numerous unresolved clues and potential suspects that police had overlooked. This reinforced the idea that someone else could have been the perpetrator. With no direct proof against Nicole and so many unanswered questions, the defense urged the jury to find her not guilty. After about a week of testimony, the jury deliberated for roughly 5.5 hours before reaching a decision. On March 26, 2025, the verdict was announced. Nicole Rice was found not guilty of the slaying of Anita Knutson. Upon hearing the jury's decision, Nicole broke down in tears, covering her face as her lawyers and family embraced her in relief and joy. On the other side of the courtroom, Anita's family sat in stunned silence. They had waited nearly 18 years for this moment, but the outcome was not what they'd hoped. Anita's sister later remarked that a not guilty verdict is not the same as innocence. While this is technically a true statement, Nicole Rice's name is, for all intents and purposes, completely cleared. At any rate, the Knutson family left the courthouse heartbroken, feeling that justice had not been served. For law enforcement, the trial's outcome meant that the question of who ended the life of Anita Knutson remained unresolved. With Rice acquitted and unable to be tried again due to double jeopardy protections, the case has essentially returned to square one. No other suspects have been charged, and authorities didn't immediately indicate any plans to continue investigating the case in the wake of Nicole's acquittal. Unfortunately, given the passage of time and the intensive focus on the wrong person, it seems unlikely this tragic slaying will ever be solved. That said, I hope the Knutson family is able to continue to pressure investigators to solve this case and get justice for Anita once and for all. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, taking a quick moment to jump in to remind you to like and subscribe and to hit the notification bell. Also remember to search up Lazy Chill True Crime wherever you get your podcasts and follow me there for more content. In 1996, 17-year-old Sharif Cousin became the youngest person ever sent to Louisiana's death row after being convicted of a shocking slaying in New Orleans. The case centered on the fatal shooting of 25-year-old Michael Girardi, who was slain by a shot to the face while on a first date in the French Quarter. It was a crime that stunned the city and set off a shocking legal saga that took years to fully resolve, leaving Cousin the victim of the legal system itself. Sharif Cousin was a teenager from New Orleans who had begun running into trouble by his mid-teens. By 16, he had fallen in with a friend named James Rowell, who led him into a series of petty robberies. Michael Girardi, by contrast, was a 25-year-old from nearby Slidell who worked as a seafood plant manager and still lived with his parents. On March 2, 1995, Girardi went into New Orleans with 37-year-old Connie Babin for dinner at Port of Call, a popular French Quarter restaurant. This was their very first date, and Girardi apparently had high expectations. Girardi even brought along a single red rose for Babin that evening, a romantic gesture that would soon be overshadowed by a night of violence. After leaving the restaurant around 10 that evening, Girardi and Babin walked toward his parked pickup truck on a dimly lit street. As they made their way down Esplanade Avenue, Babin noticed three young men approaching and felt a wave of unease. She tugged on Girardi's arm in warning, but he misunderstood and thought she was simply cold. Before they could change course, one of the teens, later alleged to be Cousin, came within a few feet of them. Babin would later recall seeing a glint of gold in the youth's teeth and noticing him bend down as if adjusting his boot, just moments before the situation turned deadly. Girardi sensed the danger at the last second and shouted for Babin to run. As she fled a short distance, a gunshot suddenly rang out. When Babin glanced back, she saw the young assailant shoot Michael Girardi point blank in the face. Girardi collapsed to the ground, mortally wounded, and the attackers grabbed his wallet and then fled into the night. Babin rushed back into the restaurant to call 911, then returned to hold Girardi's hand as he lay dying on the sidewalk. In her initial statement to police, a shaken Babin admitted it was very dark and she wasn't wearing her glasses or contacts. She claimed she hadn't gotten a good look at the gunman and doubted she could identify him. For several weeks, the case remained unsolved. Then, on March 28, 1995, New Orleans police received a tip that pointed to a suspect. 16-year-old Sharif Cousin was named by his friend James Rowell, who had been arrested for other robberies and was seeking a deal to reduce his charges. Acting on Rowell's information, detectives brought Cousin in and placed him in a lineup. Despite her earlier uncertainty, Connie Babin identified Cousin as the shooter when she saw him in the lineup. Investigators already knew Cousin as a member of a teen robbery crew plaguing the area. In fact, later in 1995, Cousin pleaded guilty to 2 separate armed robbery charges and received a 20-year prison term for those crimes. Now, however, he faced an even more serious charge, and unlike the robberies, he actually didn't do this one. Sharif Cousin's trial in January 1996 relied heavily on witness testimony, since there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. Prosecutors argued that Cousin had even bragged about the shooting to a friend. Connie Babin took the stand, and despite her prior doubts, emphatically identified Cousin as the perpetrator, and even said she would never forget his face after that night. The prosecution also called James Rowell, expecting him to back up their claims, but in a dramatic turn, Rowell recanted his story on the stand. He testified that he had never actually heard Cousin admit to the shooting. Instead, he claimed he only accused Cousin because police and prosecutors pressured him to lie in exchange for leniency on his own pending charges. He even revealed that the prosecutor had promised him a lighter 15-year sentence if he pinned the crime on Cousin. This reversal caught prosecutors off guard and undercut the state's case significantly. Apart from Babin, the only other people who had ever identified Cousin were 2 bystanders who tentatively picked his photo from a lineup weeks after the crime. However, even those IDs were far from certain. Ultimately, the case against Cousin rested almost entirely on Babin's courtroom identification, as nothing else concretely tied him to the scene. The defense countered with a strong alibi. Multiple witnesses testified that Cousin was actually playing in a youth basketball game at a community gym at the exact time of the attack. In an absolutely bonkers twist, this was an alibi that was actually backed up by a videotape of that game going down that night. Further yet, one coach even stated that he drove Cousin home after the game, dropping him off roughly 20 minutes after it ended. This was around the same time Girardi was actively being slain across town, which would require an act of speed unfathomable unless the kid got there by chopper. And I might shock you here, But Cousin didn't grow up in the lap of luxury and couldn't just call his butler to arrange a helicopter ride to commit crimes on the other side of town. Prosecutors tried to cast doubt on this evidence and at one point suggested the video's timestamp might have been wrong. Importantly, it looks as though they didn't actually lead any expert evidence on this, which seems to be a somewhat improper suggestion for the prosecution to make. After all, the prosecution has functionally infinite resources to obtain experts and can bring the full weight of the state down on someone. In my view, the prosecution should at least go out and get some expert evidence if they're going to claim the timestamp was wrong. After all, they're theoretically there to ensure justice is done, not to ensure a conviction, but more on the duties of the prosecution in a moment. Further, they argued that the coach may have not been remembering the day correctly and may have been influenced by the incorrect video timestamp. Despite the airtight alibi and the glaring inconsistencies in the state's case, the jury was surprisingly swayed by the prosecution. On January 26, 1996, they found Sharif Cousin guilty of first-degree slaying, and a few months later, he was condemned at just 17 years old. Not long after the trial, Cousin's attorneys uncovered proof that the prosecution had withheld crucial evidence. An anonymous source leaked a police report from the night of the slaying, revealing that Connie Babin told officers she didn't get a good look. The report indicated she probably couldn't identify him due to the darkness and her missing glasses, and likely would never be able to do so because of these factors. This information directly contradicted her confident trial testimony, yet the defense had never been told about it. Notably, the prosecution has a duty to disclose all evidence to the defense, including evidence that could exonerate the accused. This is because, theoretically, the state is acting in the interests of justice, and these interests don't always line up with the idea of securing a conviction. Armed with this new evidence, the defense filed a motion for a new trial, arguing that prosecutors had violated their duty by suppressing exculpatory evidence. The trial judge, however, denied the motion, forcing Cousin's team to appeal to a higher court. In April 1998, the Louisiana Supreme Court agreed that Cousin had not received a fair trial. The court unanimously overturned his conviction and ordered a new trial. In their ruling, the justices cited the prosecution's failure to disclose Babin's initial statement, along with other misconduct. It also emerged that the lead detective had fabricated a claim about having additional eyewitnesses in order to obtain the warrant for Cousin's arrest. With his conviction vacated, Cousin was removed from death row and awaited a possible retrial in jail. By this time, the weaknesses in the case were plain to see, and public pressure was mounting. Prominent activists had taken up Cousin's cause and were urging officials to drop the charges. Facing a retrial with virtually no credible evidence, New Orleans Parish District Attorney Harry Connick Sr. decided to dismiss the case. And yes, in case you're wondering, that name isn't a coincidence. That's the famous singer's dad. On January 8, 1999, all charges against Sharif Cousin were officially dropped, as the DA acknowledged there was insufficient evidence to prosecute him again. After nearly 4 years of proclaiming his innocence, Cousin was finally cleared of the slaying. Although exonerated of the capital charge, Cousin remained in prison a bit longer because of the unrelated robbery convictions. He was finally paroled in 2005, having spent about 10 years behind bars in total. Once released, Sharif Cousin turned his life around and committed himself to advocacy work. He became active in organizations that support the wrongfully convicted and at-risk youth, using his own story to educate others. Sharif remains dedicated to preventing similar injustices from happening to anyone else. Unfortunately, though, the slaying of Michael Girardi continues to go unpunished until this day and will almost certainly never be resolved given the conduct of the investigators. On a cold February day in 1983, park rangers in Utah's Arches National Park made a grim discovery. It was the body of a young man, half buried in the red desert sand, with a bullet wound in his skull. With no identification and advanced decomposition, the victim became known as yet another one of the nation's John Does. It took 42 years of detective work before authorities finally put a name to that John Doe. He turned out to be Robbie Pay, a 17-year-old who had vanished just a few months before his body was found. Identifying him answered one question, but raised another. Who ended the life of Robbie, and why? Robbie Pay was 17 years old and from Provo, Utah. In the fall of 1982, he was staying at a youth center in Salt Lake City, which is essentially a juvenile facility where parents send their quote-unquote troubled teens. These are highly controversial private facilities that seem to impose weird and draconian punishments upon teens undergoing normal rebellious phases as they transition to adulthood. On October 7th, 1982, Robbie escaped from that center and never returned. His family reported him missing, and police opened a case to find the runaway teen. Investigators later learned that after running away, Robbie had been in contact with a 56-year-old man originally from the Netherlands, and the two were believed to have been living together. In the months after Robbie disappeared, there were hints he might still be alive, and friends reported occasional communication, but all contact abruptly stopped in early 1983. On February 12, 1983, the mystery took a gruesome turn. Park staff at Arches National Park discovered a body in a remote area called the Three Gossips Formation. This young male had been eliminated execution style. The location was over 200 miles from Provo. The victim's physical characteristics, age, build, hair color, strongly resembled Robbie. Investigators immediately suspected this John Doe might be the missing teen. However, confirming the identity proved difficult. Decomposition had destroyed many identifying features. Investigators compared the John Doe's teeth with Robbie's dental records, but initially they didn't find a match. Years later, they would discover a clerical error in how Robbie's dental x-rays were filed, which had messed up the comparison. With no positive ID, authorities listed the Desert John Doe as an unsolved slaying. The unknown victim was buried in an unmarked grave in Moab, and Robbie Pay remained a missing person. By 1990, after 8 years without answers, Robbie's family had him declared legally deceased and placed a gravestone for him in the Provo City Cemetery. In 1993, a decade after Robbie vanished, a shocking piece of evidence surfaced. Robbie's pickup truck was found underwater in Lake Powell, on the Utah-Arizona border. Drought conditions had lowered the water level and exposed the submerged vehicle. Even more telling, a rope was tied to the steering wheel, indicating the truck had been sent into the lake deliberately. Over the years, police also fielded some strange tips about Robbie's fate. One lead claimed he was living in Colorado under an alias. Another alleged he was slain during a dangerous game of Russian roulette and buried in the mountains. Both stories were investigated and dismissed as baseless by the authorities. Throughout this time, one person of interest lingered on the periphery, the older man from the Netherlands. After Robbie disappeared, that man also left Utah, reportedly returning to Europe. He has never been located, and it is uncertain if he's alive at this point, given that he would be well into his 90s. Authorities haven't formally called him a suspect, but they still want to talk to him, believing he might know details about Robbie's final days. Notably, police found letters the man had written to Robbie among the teen's belongings. though the exact nature of these letters isn't known to the public. In 2018, Provo police took a fresh look with new technology. Detectives entered Robbie's information into NamUs, a national missing person database, and got a crucial break. A forensic dentist noticed that Robbie's dental records had been entered incorrectly in the system. When the error was corrected, the records showed a strong similarity between Robbie and the John Doe's teeth. This gave investigators renewed hope that the John Doe was indeed Robbie Pay. Still, they needed DNA evidence to be sure. That posed a challenge. The case was so old that obtaining DNA from the John Doe's remains was difficult, and Robbie had been adopted as a baby. This meant that investigators couldn't simply ask his relatives for a sample. An earlier attempt to extract DNA from a lock of Robbie's hair had failed to yield results, though improved forensic technology eventually did lead to a profile. The team petitioned the courts to unseal his adoption records, and in 2022 succeeded. From those records, they identified a living biological uncle of Robbie's and obtained a DNA swab from him. When Robbie's uncle's DNA was compared to the DNA profile, it matched. The identification was officially announced in March 2025, and the first part of the decades-old mystery was finally solved. Robbie's family, after so many years of not knowing, learned his fate at last. Unfortunately, it was a bittersweet breakthrough given that friends and family had long clung to the rumors that he had simply started up a new life. Now that Robbie's identity is known, his case has been reclassified as an active investigation into his slaying. Detectives are poring over the old case file and evidence with fresh eyes, determined to find out who was responsible for his slaying. One obvious focus is the older man who was with Robbie after he ran away. His sudden departure abroad after 1983 is more than a little suspicious, and investigators believe he may hold crucial information about the case. Another angle is the sunken truck, with the lengths taken to hide Bobby's vehicle suggesting a likely premeditated cover-up. It's unclear if any meaningful forensic evidence was recovered from the vehicle, though ultimately, given the amount of time it spent underwater, I would suspect that it wouldn't be. That said, we don't know for sure, but if the person who disposed of the vehicle could be found, it's likely that the perpetrator would be as well. So far, no suspects have been publicly named, though personally, I think we're all suspecting the 57-year-old definitely had a hand in it. Obviously, there was something extremely sinister going on there, though of course without knowing the nature of the relationship, this can only be grim speculation at this point. With the case back in the spotlight and police using modern forensic methods to re-examine the cold case clues, we may see a final resolution to Robbie's case one day soon. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here taking a quick moment to jump in to remind you to like and subscribe and to hit the notification bell. Also remember to search up Lazy Chill True Crime wherever you get your podcasts and follow me over there for more content. It was June 1984 when a gruesome discovery shocked Phoenix. Inside a dumpster in an industrial area lay the dismembered torso of a young female. For over 40 years, she was known only as the unidentified Delray Jane Doe, but now her name has finally been restored. She was Renee Nilsson, a 14-year-old girl who vanished after leaving home to go swimming. With her identity uncovered decades later, the haunting question remains: who committed this sick act and why? Renee Nilsson was just 14 years old and lived in Phoenix, Arizona. In late May 1984, she left her home one afternoon to go swimming and never returned. Her family reported her missing, and a frantic search began in vain. About 2 weeks after Renee disappeared, on June 10, 1984, Partial human remains were discovered in a dumpster near 21st Avenue and McDowell Road in Phoenix. The remains were wrapped in newspapers dated June 3rd, suggesting the victim had been slain shortly after that date. The perpetrator had severed the victim's head and limbs, presumably with a saw, and those parts were never recovered. This brutal mutilation made it immediately clear that someone was attempting to cover up the identity of the slain individual. Identifying the victim was extremely difficult with so much of the body missing. At the time, no one realized this Jane Doe might be the same girl who had gone missing 2 weeks earlier. Further, the presumed age and circumstances just didn't line up with a 14-year-old, so Renee's missing person report remained unlinked to the body. Investigators initially guessed that Jane Doe was a white female around 18 years old. Further, forensic experts theorized she might have been a young mother, a hypothesis later proven false when her true age came to light. With no name, the unknown girl was dubbed the Delray Jane Doe, after the area where she was found. Despite a police investigation, no immediate suspects or leads emerged. In the pre-DNA era of 1984, without an identity or eyewitnesses, the case eventually went cold and languished for decades as an unsolved mystery. In 2023, the dormant case was reopened thanks to advances in forensic technology. The Maricopa County Medical Examiner's Office partnered with the DNA Doe Project, a nonprofit specializing in identifying cold case remains, to analyze the Jane Doe's DNA. By 2024, genealogists had developed a DNA profile and found matches to some distant relatives. Using family tree research, they eventually discovered that the unidentified victim was Renee Isabel Nielsen, the same 14-year-old reported missing in Phoenix in 1984. Modern forensic anthropology also helped correct the original age estimate, confirming the victim was much younger than investigators in 1984 believed. In May 2025, additional DNA testing confirmed the match, finally giving the Delray Doe her name back. Notably, as genetic genealogists worked through her case, they uncovered a bizarre potential clue. And I say potential clue because there's nothing as of yet to indicate that this is actually related to the case directly, but it's very weird and extremely unsettling. A person stole Renee's name and identity, and it appeared on a 1987 marriage certificate 3 years after she was deceased. Essentially, an unknown individual assumed the identity of a slain 14-year-old, adding a whole new layer to the case. Detectives now have to consider not only who had slain Renee, but who took her name and whether those two questions might have the same answer. With Renee's identity uncovered, investigators are actively pursuing leads to finally identify the perpetrator. One theory centers on the mysterious woman who stole Renee's identity. If this person knew Renee was missing or dead, it's possible she was involved in the crime. Perhaps the perpetrator or an accomplice assumed Renee's identity to hide their own past or to start a new life. So far, the person behind this identity fraud has not been named publicly, but finding her could be the key to cracking the case. Police are working to track down this individual, seeing if she had any link to Renee or motive to harm her. The idea that the perpetrator might have literally taken over the victim's identity seems like something out of a movie or show, but it's a lead authorities can't ignore. Another theory is that Renee was the victim of a random predator, an unknown attacker with no personal connection to her. The sheer brutality of the slaying suggests a deeply disturbed offender who may have struck opportunistically. Renee could have been abducted by a stranger after she left home, targeted at random by someone cruising for a victim. Back in 1984, investigators considered the possibility of a quote-unquote psycho serial predator at work. However, no other slayings in Phoenix were definitively linked to this case. That said, it might have been a one-off crime by someone passing through, which is why no connection has ever been made. Today, Renee Nilsson's slaying remains unsolved, but the case is far from closed. Detectives have stressed that they will never give up on seeking justice for Renee. The combination of modern DNA technology and renewed public interest has given this 41-year-old case fresh momentum. Investigators are re-examining evidence, following new tips, and continuing to explore the identity theft angle. As the midnight hush blanketed the Tennessee wilderness, two gunshots rang out from a lonely inn along the Natchez Trace on October 11th, 1809. When dawn broke, America's famed explorer Meriwether Lewis was found mortally wounded, bleeding from gunshot wounds to the head and chest. Just 3 years earlier, Lewis had returned as a national hero from an epic journey across the uncharted West. Now, at only 35 years old, he lay dead under mysterious circumstances. Until this day, historians still debate whether his demise was the final act of a troubled soul or the bloody deed of an unknown assailant. Born in Virginia in 1774, Meriwether Lewis was an American explorer, soldier, and politician, best known for his role as leader of the Lewis and Clark expedition. From a young age, Lewis proved himself an outdoorsman with keen survival skills on the frontier. He served in the militia and U.S. Army, where he gained leadership experience on the western frontier. In 1701, President Thomas Jefferson, a family friend, chose the 27-year-old Lewis to serve as his personal secretary in the president's house. Jefferson soon tapped Lewis to command an ambitious mission that would make him one of history's great explorers. Lewis recruited his former Army comrade William Clark as co-captain, and together they prepared to venture into the vast unknown lands recently acquired by the United States. In May 1804, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark set off from St. Louis at the head of the Corps of Discovery. This was a team of about 40 people tasked with exploring the Louisiana Purchase and beyond. Over the next 2.5 years, the expedition traveled nearly 8,000 miles through wilderness, traversing the Great Plains, over the Rocky Mountains, and all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And once they got to the Pacific, they turned around and did it all over again. Along the journey, Lewis and his team mapped uncharted rivers and mountains and made contact with many Native American tribes, securing peaceable relations and gathering information. Their successful trek proved that overland travel to the Pacific was possible and helped ignite America's vision of manifest destiny. Lewis returned to St. Louis in September 1806 as a celebrated hero of discovery. He and Clark were hailed for their courage and achievements, and few figures loomed larger in the American imagination than these two figures. Lewis's life after the expedition, however, was far from the victorious glory one might imagine. In 1707, President Jefferson rewarded his protege by appointing Lewis governor of the Upper Louisiana Territory, a vast jurisdiction based in St. Louis. At just 33, Lewis suddenly had heavy administrative responsibilities on the frontier. He tried to carry out Jefferson's vision in the territory, publishing laws, establishing roads, and negotiating with various Native American tribes. However, Lewis struggled in his new role, and he ended up in conflict with his own administration, and he even faced allegations of misappropriating government funds. Because of these allegations, one governmental department refused to reimburse him for money he had paid out for governmental tasks, leaving him crushed financially. He ended up heavily in debt, and creditors demanded their money, forcing him to liquidate land he'd earned for his expedition service. By 1809, the once renowned explorer was facing ruinous debt and a damaged reputation. Lewis also failed to produce the edited journals of the expedition for publication, a task Jefferson eagerly awaited. The pressure of that unfinished work weighed on him, and he struggled with loneliness and ill health. He never married or found lasting love, and some accounts suggest he struggled with addiction. Friends grew concerned as Lewis reportedly cycled between intense bouts of energy and dark periods of depression. One month he would be highly expansive and productive, and the next month he would be virtually unable to function. Even Thomas Jefferson noted that Lewis's family had a history of quote-unquote hypochondriac affections, a term now generally understood to describe the ups and downs of bipolar disorder. All of these troubles set the stage for a journey that Lewis hoped would solve his problems, but which instead led to his tragic end. By September 1709, Meriwether Lewis decided to travel to Washington, D.C., to straighten out his affairs. He planned to personally appeal the government's refusal to pay his bills and clear his name of any wrongdoing. He also carried his precious expedition journals, intending to finally get them into the hands of a publisher. Lewis departed St. Louis on September 4th, 1809, accompanied by his personal servant, a free African-American man named John Pernia. Initially, Lewis intended to take a riverboat south to New Orleans and catch a ship to Washington. However, en route, rumors of a conflict with Britain made him fear that traveling by sea could be risky. He couldn't bear the thought of British forces seizing his journals if war broke out. This would have been, in essence, a national security nightmare, and would have given the British a massive advantage on the West Coast and the Great Plains region. Thus, he altered his plans and opted for an overland route via the Natchez Trace, the old frontier road through the wilderness from Mississippi up to Nashville. This route was notoriously dangerous. The Natchez Trace was plagued by highwaymen who preyed on travelers. Aware of the risks, Lewis even wrote his will before setting out. Lewis reached Fort Pickering, near present-day Memphis, by river on September 15th, 1809. There, witnesses began to sense something was amiss in the explorer's state of mind. The captain of the boat that brought Lewis downriver later reported that Lewis had been acting strangely during the trip. He noted that at one point Lewis was suffering what was described as a quote-unquote mental derangement. Fort Pickering's commander detained Lewis for several days until he seemed to recover his senses. On September 29th, Lewis left Fort Pickering to continue overland on the Natchez Trace, now traveling with Major James Neely. It didn't take long for Lewis's companions to observe his disturbed frame of mind returning. According to one account, Lewis again appeared, quote, deranged shortly after leaving the fort. Clearly, the governor was under severe psychological strain as he pushed deeper into the lonely frontier. By early October, the party was making its way through the thick forests of Tennessee. On October 10th, 1809, Meriwether Lewis arrived at a remote roadside inn known as Grinder's Stand, about 70 miles southwest of Nashville along the Natchez Trace. Because Major Neely had fallen behind, delayed to round up some stray horses, Lewis came to the inn with just his servant John Pernia and Neely's servant as companions. The inn was a crude log cabin outfit run by Robert Grinder and his wife Priscilla. Mr. Grinder was away, but Mrs. Grinder offered lodging. She gave Lewis the use of a small cabin room, while the two servants stayed in the stable, and she and her children slept in a separate kitchen building a short distance away. Accounts agree that Lewis was agitated and behaving oddly on the evening of October 10th. Mrs. Grinder later said that during dinner, Lewis stood and paced the room, talking to himself as if arguing points in a speech or legal case, his face flushed with emotion. He eventually retired to his room, but throughout the night the innkeeper's wife could hear him continuing to murmur and talk to himself in a passionate, unsettled tone. Sometime in the pre-dawn hours of October 11th, The quiet darkness was pierced by the sound of a shot. According to Mrs. Grinder, she heard multiple shots, a scuffle, and a cry for help from Lewis's cabin. Frightened, she didn't immediately rush over. By one report, she peered out to see the wounded Lewis crawling on hands and knees back into his room. After that, things ended up getting even more unusual. Despite seeing and hearing what she saw, she did nothing until morning, which some sources call an inexplicable action. To interject my own personal view, we've already established that she was operating a small roadside inn in a lawless part of the country, and her husband was away. If Lewis was indeed attacked that night, it seems likely that her going out to confront the assailants may have simply led to more violence that night. At first light, Mrs. Grinder sent her children to find the servants. John Pernia and the other man ran to the cabin to discover Meriwether Lewis sprawled on the floor, bleeding profusely from 2 wounds, one in his head and one in his abdomen. Incredibly, Lewis was still clinging to life, though barely. He was conscious enough to speak a few words where he spoke incoherently, apparently stating that he wasn't a coward, but that he had to die. Over the next hour or two, Meriwether Lewis bled out on a buffalo robe, and by sunrise, the great explorer was dead. Lewis's sudden death was a devastating shock to those who heard the news. He had been only 35 years old, and seemingly on the cusp of resolving his troubles. Major Neely arrived at Grinder's stand later on October 11th and was tasked with the grim duty of handling the remains. In the absence of formal clergy or family, Neely had Lewis's body buried near the inn, just a few hundred yards from the spot where he died. There was no ceremony, a tragic, quiet end for a national hero. Neely wrote to President Jefferson a week later, informing him that his friend had done this to himself. News of Lewis's death traveled slowly by word of mouth and letters, but when it reached the wider public, it was often sensationalized. A Nashville newspaper printed a lurid account claiming to know all the gory details of what happened. Other papers around the country reprinted and embellished the story. From the very start, the facts of what happened in that lonely cabin were muddled by hearsay and speculation. No one had actually seen Lewis fire the fatal shots, and the only supposed witness, Mrs. Priscilla Grinder, gave conflicting stories over time about what she heard and did that night. According to various secondhand versions of Mrs. Grinder's testimony, her accounts differed on key details. In one version, she described hearing Lewis arguing loudly with himself, and then the shots, after which he staggered wounded from his room, pleading for help before collapsing. In another version, she claimed that before the shooting, she heard voices of other men and a commotion as if strangers had confronted Lewis. Yet Mrs. Grinder never wrote any statement down, and by the time others recorded her story, details had changed. This inconsistency has led some to suspect that her testimony was fabricated or at the very least unreliable. Meanwhile, the physical evidence was troubling. Lewis had 2 wounds, one in the head and one in the chest, yet somehow lived for a short time after. In addition, the money Lewis had carried, borrowed to fund his travel, was missing when his body was found. Missing funds and the dangerous reputation of the Natchez Trace fueled whispers that Lewis might have been ambushed by highwaymen. The area was indeed known for bandits who wouldn't hesitate to end the lives of travelers. However, neither of the 2 servants present reported seeing any intruders that night. All we have are the eerie echoes of shots in the dark and a handful of inconsistent recollections. In keeping with frontier law, a local magistrate convened a brief coroner's inquest on Lewis's body shortly after his death. They're believed to have found no evidence of foul play. Unfortunately, the written report from this 1809 inquest was later lost, so we don't know their exact conclusions or reasoning. There's actually a major hiccup in the case related to this initial inquest, though, and I'll circle back to that in a moment. Lewis's family back in Virginia was horrified at the suggestion that Merriweather would have done it to himself. His mother and relatives flatly believed he had been slain, suspecting either his servant Pernia or unknown robbers as the culprits. Governor Lewis's family, concerned with his legacy, found it hard to accept that a man of such stature could succumb to such an act, which in those days carried an extreme stigma. By contrast, Lewis's close friends and colleagues, including William Clark and Thomas Jefferson, had little doubt that Lewis perished due to his own acts. Upon receiving the tragic news, Jefferson wrote that Lewis had a, quote, constitutional disposition toward depression and had experienced several severe depressive episodes before. The former president sadly concluded that his friend became deranged and did it to himself. Clark, too, knew of Lewis's prior emotional struggles and accepted the official explanation, grieving that the weight of his comrade's mind had overcome him. Over time, the death of Meriwether Lewis evolved into one of early America's great historical mysteries, with the two positions being cemented almost immediately. The theory that he did it himself hinges on his pre-existing psychological issues, which were exacerbated by his deep financial troubles. Further, he was keen on drinking, and was also known to heavily engage in the use of laudanum, further factors which could have pushed him over the metaphorical edge. Notably, one modern hypothesis suggests he had contracted malaria during his many travels, and late-stage malaria can cause dementia, delirium, and depressive episodes. Another theory claims he might have had syphilis, which in advanced stages can lead to severe neurological and psychological symptoms. Whatever the exact cause, proponents of this theory paint a picture of a man in deep despair who unfortunately felt like he had no options left. Yet, despite the strong case that he did it himself, doubts have lingered from the beginning. Critics asked from the beginning why Mrs. Grinder didn't investigate immediately if she heard Lewis pleading for help. Her contradictory statements have led some to wonder if she concealed knowledge of other individuals at the scene. In the most extreme form, some have suggested that this inn was actually a trap, and that the Grinders were working in conjunction with local bandits. Under this theory, most of the time, the inn was a perfectly legitimate institution for travelers passing through. However, when a traveler came through with a significant amount of wealth, the Grinders would tip off local highwaymen that they'd landed a big fish in their net. Under usual circumstances, the highwaymen would then accost the traveler after stalking them beyond the inn, so as not to raise suspicions. However, according to this theory, some believe greed may have taken hold quickly, and they couldn't wait. John Pernia, Lewis's servant, also comes under the microscope in some theories. Lewis's own mother reportedly suspected this servant might have slain her son for money and fled. People who believe Pernia was responsible claim that he perished by his own hand a few years later. However, all that the official records note is that he died of a laudanum overdose in 1810, which may very well have been accidental. Some theorists have speculated about political motives for the slaying, suggesting perhaps someone wanted Lewis silenced. One angle involved General James Wilkinson or other officials who might have been implicated in financial scandals. Notably, Wilkinson was known to be a scandalous individual during his lifetime, but the true bombshell about the man didn't come until well after his death. In 1854, he was revealed to have been a Spanish spy and had actually spent his life directly acting against American interests. That said, despite this, there's no hard evidence to suggest that Lewis was eliminated on the orders of Wilkinson, though it is theoretically possible. One intriguing piece of historical evidence favoring this hypothesis came decades after Lewis's death. In 1848, Tennessee officials undertook to locate Lewis's neglected grave and erect a proper monument. When they partially exhumed his remains, the examining doctor and commission members were struck by what they saw. The official report noted that while everyone had assumed Lewis committed the act himself, they found that his skull had received damage that wasn't explained. The report concluded that it was probable that he had been slain, but given the passage of time, they couldn't offer anything further in the way of analysis. This startling conclusion by a state commission 39 years after the fact gave the theory a kind of early forensic boost. In 1996, a coroner's jury in Lewis County, Tennessee, even recommended exhumation, reasoning that modern science might finally resolve the case. However, because the grave lies on National Park Service land, federal permission was required. The Department of the Interior initially approved the exhumation in 2008, then reversed the decision in 2010. They cited concerns about disturbing the pioneer cemetery around the grave and a desire to let Lewis rest in peace. To this day, the remains haven't been exhumed, and the exact cause of Lewis's death remains unconfirmed. More than 2 centuries later, the death of Meriwether Lewis remains an evocative mystery at the intersection of American history and true crime. On one hand, the evidence of Lewis's inner demons presents a compelling case that this legendary explorer perhaps took that irrevocable act in an extremely dark moment. On the other hand, the unresolved quirks of that October night leave lingering doubt that foul play could have occurred. Perhaps one day the federal government will allow his remains to be exhumed, and maybe, just maybe, we'll see the end of this more than 2 centuries old mystery in our lifetimes.